Charleston greeted her with its humid embrace as she crossed the Ravenel Bridge, the Cooper River glinting gold in the late afternoon sun. The city's charm was undeniable. Cobblestone streets, pastel row houses, the faint scent of salt and magnolias drifting through her open window. She pulled up to Jessica's apartment on East Bay Street, a second-floor walk-up in a converted warehouse overlooking the Battery. Jessica was waiting on the stoop, a glass of rosé in hand, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. She waved enthusiastically as Andrea parked. "Welcome to paradise, babe," Jessica called, descending the steps in a pair of cut-off shorts and a tank top that showed off her tanned arms. She hugged Andrea tightly, the wine sloshing dangerously close to Andrea's blouse. "You made it. I knew you'd come." Andrea forced a smile, hefting her bag from the trunk. "Yeah, I guess I did." Inside, the apartment was a chaotic mix of bohemian chic and post-divorce disarray, beaded curtains, a velvet sofa piled with throw pillows, empty wine bottles lining the kitchen counter. Jessica flopped onto the couch, patting the cushion beside her. "Sit. Tell me everything." "How'd he take it?" Andrea sank down, the weight of the day pressing into her shoulders. "Not well. He told me to leave if I wanted this. Said he wouldn't share me." Jessica rolled her eyes, sipping her rosé. "Typical Rob, so damn rigid. He's got that mountain man mentality, thinks marriage is some sacred contract you can't bend. You're not his property, Andrea." "I know," Andrea said, though the words felt hollow, "but he's hurt, really hurt. I didn't expect him to be so final about it." Jessica leaned forward, her hazel eyes sharp. "Listen to me. You're 29, gorgeous, and stuck in a rut up there in Asheville. Rob's a good guy, sure, but he's boring. You deserve to feel alive, to have fun. That's what I learned after my divorce. Life's too short to play by someone else's rules." Andrea nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. Jessica's divorce had been a train wreck, caught cheating with a coworker at a bar on King Street, her husband kicking her out of their Mount Pleasant home. She'd landed here in this cluttered apartment and turned her freedom into a crusade. Andrea had always admired Jessica's confidence, her ability to reinvent herself, but now she wondered if she'd signed up for the same chaos. "Come on," Jessica said, standing and pulling Andrea up. "We're going out. You need a drink and a distraction. There's a spot on Market Street. Great music. Hot guys. You'll see what I mean about living a little." Back in Asheville, Rob stood in the garage of their Montford Avenue home, staring at the boxes he'd started packing with Andrea's things. Her sweaters, her books, the framed photo of them at Klingman's Dome, all relics of a life that felt like a lie now. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old hardwood floors. He turned off his phone after her last text. "I'm staying with Jess for a bit. We'll talk soon." He didn't want to talk. Not yet. He grabbed a wrench from his toolbox and started tightening a loose bolt on his mountain bike, a specialized stump jumper he had bought last spring. The repetitive motion calmed him, gave his hands something to do while his mind raced. How had it come to this? 5 years ago, they danced barefoot on Tybee Island near Savannah, laughing as the waves crashed around their ankles. He'd promised her forever, and she'd promised him the same. Now she wanted more, whatever the hell that meant. The pendant box sat on the workbench, unopened. He'd meant to return it, but something stopped him. Pride, maybe, or the faint hope she'd come back and he could still give it to her. Stupid, he thought, tossing the wrench down. She wasn't coming back, not the Andrea he knew. He needed air. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped outside into the crisp Asheville night. The streets of Montford were quiet, the Victorian houses glowing with warm light. He walked past the Grey Rock Inn down Chestnut Street until he reached Pack Square Park. The fountain was still running, its soft gurgle a stark contrast to the storm in his chest. He sat on a bench, staring at the Vance Monument, and let the cold seep into his bones. Charleston's Market Street buzzed with energy as Andrea and Jessica pushed through the crowd at the Blind Tiger pub. The air smelled of fried oysters and spilled beer, the live band's cover of Sweet Caroline vibrating through the packed room. Jessica handed Andrea a vodka soda, shouting over the noise, "Drink up, first night of freedom." Andrea took a sip, the lime sharp on her tongue. She felt out of place in her sensible cardigan and jeans, surrounded by women in tight dresses and men with slicked, back hair. Jessica, though, was in her element, flirting with a guy at the bar who looked like he'd stepped out of a frat house in Colombia. Within 20 minutes, she dragged Andrea over to meet him and his friend, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Tyler, with a Charleston drawl and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Tyler's a contractor, Jessica said, nudging Andrea. Works on those big houses out on Sullivan's Island. And this is Andrea, fresh off the boat from Asheville. Tyler's gaze lingered on Andrea, making her shift uncomfortably. Asheville, huh? What brings you down to the low country? She's taking a break from the mountain life, Jessica answered for her, laughing. Needs some excitement. Andrea smiled weakly, sipping her drink to avoid replying. Tyler leaned closer, his cologne overpowering. Well, you found the right place. Charleston's got plenty to offer a pretty girl like you. The night blurred from there. More drinks, more small talk. Jessica disappearing with the frat guy, while Tyler stuck to Andrea like glue. By midnight, they were outside on the cobblestones, the humid air clinging to her skin. Tyler's hand brushed her arm, and she flinched, suddenly aware of how far she'd drifted from herself. I should go, she said, stepping back. Jess is waiting. Tyler shrugged, unfazed. Suit yourself. See you around, Asheville. She found Jessica back at the apartment an hour later, sprawled on the couch with a smug grin. So, how was Tyler? Andrea dropped her purse, exhaustion hitting her like a wave. He's fine, I don't know. This isn't me, Jess. Jessica sat up, frowning. Come on, Andrea. You wanted this. Freedom, fun. Don't back out now. You've got to give it a chance. Andrea sank into an armchair, staring at the beaded curtains swaying in the breeze from an open window. She thought of Rob, the way he'd looked at her in the dining room, hurt and resolute. She'd wanted to feel alive, but all she felt now was lost. In Asheville, Rob lay awake in their empty bed, the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the room. He couldn't sleep, couldn't stop replaying Andrea's words. I need more. Tomorrow he'd call his lawyer friend in downtown Asheville, start figuring out what came next. But tonight he let the mountains hold him, their silent strength the only thing keeping him from falling apart. The Charleston sunrise painted the sky over the battery in streaks of pink and gold, but Andrea barely noticed. She sat on Jessica's balcony, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in her hands, staring at the palmetto tree swaying in the morning breeze. It had been a week since she'd left Asheville, a week since she'd walked out on Rob and into the strange, unmoored version of herself. The apartment smelled of last night's tequila and Jessica's lavender candles, a combination that made her stomach turn. She hadn't slept well. Tyler's lingering cologne and the memory of his hand on her arm kept creeping into her dreams. Jessica emerged from her bedroom, stretching in an oversized t-shirt, her hair a wild tangle. Morning, sunshine, she said, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. You look like hell. Rough night? Andrea rubbed her eyes. I didn't sleep much. That bar, Tyler, it's all a blur. Jessica laughed, flopping onto the wicker chair across from her. That's the point, babe. You're supposed to let go. Have fun. Tyler's harmless, just a guy looking for a good time. You didn't do anything stupid, did you? No, Andrea said quickly, though she wasn't sure what stupid meant anymore. I don't know if this is what I wanted, Jess. It feels wrong. Jessica's smile faded, replaced by a hard edge. Wrong, Andrea, you left Rob because you were suffocating up there in Asheville. You told me you needed this. Freedom, excitement. Don't chicken out now. You've barely started. Andrea set the mug down, the ceramic clinking against the glass tabletop. I know what I said, but I didn't think it'd feel like this, like I'm betraying him. He's probably sitting at home right now, hating me. Let him hate you, Jessica said, leaning forward. He'll get over it, or he won't. Either way, this is about you, not him. You're 29, not 50. You've got years ahead to play the perfect wife if that's what you want. Right now, live a little. Andrea wanted to argue, to say that Rob wasn't just some obstacle to her happiness, but Jessica's certainty was infectious. Maybe she was right. Maybe this unease was just growing pains, the cost of breaking free. She nodded, forcing a small smile. Okay, what's the plan then? Jessica grinned, her energy snapping back. Tonight, we're hitting King Street. There's a new spot, Henry's. Live music, great cocktails. I've got a couple guys meeting us there. You'll love it. 3 hours north, in Asheville, Rob stood in the lobby of his lawyer's office on Biltmore Avenue, the hum of downtown traffic filtering through the windows. The building was an old brick structure, its walls lined with photos of the Biltmore estate and vintage maps of Buncombe County. His friend Mark, a real estate attorney, had referred him to Lisa Grayson, a divorce specialist with a reputation for cutting through bullshit. Rob wasn't sure he was ready for this. Divorce felt like a guillotine hanging over his neck, but he couldn't keep living in limbo. Lisa's office was small but sharp, all clean lines and legal books stacked neatly on a mahogany shelf. She was in her late 40s with steel gray hair pulled into a bun and eyes that saw through you. "So," she said, settling behind her desk, "you think your wife's stepping out? Tell me what's going on." Rob shifted in the leather chair, his hands clasped tight. "She wants an open marriage. Told me last week she needs to explore herself. She's staying with a friend in Charleston now, Jessica Monroe. Told her if she does this, we're done." Lisa scribbled something on a legal pad. "Open marriage, huh? That's a bold move. Any evidence she's already acting on it?" "Not yet," Rob admitted, "but she's with Jessica. That's enough to make me suspicious. Jess is, trouble. Caught cheating on her own husband a couple years back. I don't trust her influence." Lisa nodded, tapping her pen. "Smart to be cautious. North Carolina's a no-fault divorce state, so infidelity doesn't change the asset split unless it's egregious. Think financial damage, like her spending marital funds on lovers. But it can help with leverage. You want to file now or wait for proof?" Rob hesitated, staring at a framed photo of the French Broad River on the wall. Filing meant admitting it was over, that the Andrea he'd married was gone. But waiting meant more nights alone in that empty house, wondering what she was doing in Charleston. "Let's start the paperwork," he said finally. "Hold it until I say go. I need to be sure." "Fair enough," Lisa said, jotting another note. "I'll get a PI on retainer if you want. Someone discreet. Charleston's not far, couple days. We could have photos, texts, whatever's out there." Rob swallowed hard. "Yeah, do it." He left the office with a knot in his chest, stepping onto the sidewalk where the autumn leaves crunched underfoot. The mountains loomed in the distance, steady and unchanging, but his world felt like it was crumbling. He drove home to Montford Avenue, parked in the driveway, and sat there, staring at the bungalow. The porch swings swayed in the breeze, a ghost of the evenings he and Andrea had spent there with glasses of wine from Burnt Shirt Vineyards. Now it was just him, the silence, and the weight of what came next. That night, Charleston's King Street pulsed with life. Henry's was a sleek, modern bar with exposed brick walls and a rooftop patio overlooking the city. The band, a trio from Savannah playing bluesy rock, filled the air with gritty chords as Andrea followed Jessica through the crowd. She'd swapped her cardigan for a black top Jessica had lent her, feeling exposed but determined to push through the discomfort. Jessica introduced her to two guys at a high-top table. Matt, a real estate agent with a Rolex and a cocky grin, and Chris, a quieter type who worked at the port. Matt bought the first round, a tray of palmetto martinis that tasted like citrus and regret. "To new friends," he toasted, clinking glasses with Andrea. She smiled, sipping the drink, and tried to ignore the wedding band tan line on his left hand. The night spiraled from there, dancing on the rooftop, the skyline of Charleston glittering below, Matt's arms slipping around her waist. He smelled of bourbon and ambition, whispering compliments in her ear that made her skin prickle. Chris hung back, watching with a mix of amusement and disinterest, while Jessica flitted between them and another group by the bar. By 1 a.m., Andrea was dizzy, the alcohol blurring the edges of her guilt. Matt walked her to Jessica's car, parked near the customs house. "You're fun, Asheville," he said, leaning in too close. "We should do this again." "Maybe," Andrea murmured, stepping back. He smirked, handed her his number on a crumpled receipt, and sauntered off into the night. Back at the apartment, Jessica kicked off her heels and collapsed onto the couch. "See? Told you it'd be a blast. Matt's into you, total catch." "He's married," Andrea said, sinking into the armchair. "I saw the tan line." Jessica shrugged. "So, half the guys here are. Doesn't mean anything. They're just blowing off steam." "You're not marrying him, Andrea. You're exploring." Andrea stared at the ceiling, the beaded curtains casting shadows like prison bars. Exploring. That's what she'd told Rob, what she'd told herself. But this didn't feel like discovery. It felt like drowning. In Asheville, Rob woke to a gray dawn, the mountains hidden behind a curtain of fog. He'd slept fitfully, dreaming of Andrea laughing on Tybee Island, her hair tangled with sea salt. The dream dissolved into the reality of her absence. and he dragged himself out of bed, brewing coffee in the quiet kitchen. His phone buzzed, a text from Lisa. PI's headed to Charleston today. We'll update soon. He stared at the screen, the coffee bitter on his tongue. Part of him wanted the PI to find nothing, to give him a reason to call Andrea back. But another part, the part that had watched her walk out, knew the truth was already slipping through his fingers. He grabbed his bike and rode out to the Blue Ridge Parkway, the wind cutting through his jacket as he pedaled past Bent Creek. The trees were a riot of red and gold, their beauty a stark contrast to the ache in his chest. He didn't know what came next, but he knew he couldn't stay still, not while Andrea was rewriting their story in Charleston. Dưới đây là phần tiếp theo của Shadows of Loyalty, tập trung vào việc Andrea ngày càng lún sâu vào lối sống phóng túng ở Charleston, South Carolina, trong khi Rob bắt đầu tìm kiếm sự cân bằng ở Asheville, North Carolina, với một bước ngoặt dần anh đến Nashville, Tennessee. Tôi sẽ viết khoảng 2,000 từ nữa, tiếp tục phát triển xung đột và giới thiệu sự xuất hiện của Diane. Sau đó tôi sẽ cho ý kiến của bạn để tiến hành tiếp. Chapter 4. The undertow in the horizon. 2 weeks had passed since Andrea arrived in Charleston, and the city had become both a refuge and a trap. The salty air off the Ashley River clung to her skin as she sat on Jessica's balcony, scrolling through her phone. She hadn't texted Rob since that first night. No apologies, no explanations. Every time she typed his name, her fingers froze, guilt twisting in her gut like a low-country tide pulling her under. Instead, she'd let Jessica fill the silence with plans, nights at the Commodore on Meeting Street, brunches at Poogan's porch, endless rounds of drinks with men whose names she barely remembered. Tonight was no different. Jessica burst into the apartment at dusk, her arms full of shopping bags from King Street boutiques. "Get dressed, babe," she called, dumping the bags on the velvet sofa. "We're hitting Folly Beach. Matt's throwing a bonfire party. Whole crew's gonna be there." Andrea glanced up from her phone where she'd been staring at a photo of her and Rob from last summer, standing on the summit of Mount Mitchell, his arm around her, both of them grinning like the world was theirs. She swiped it away. "I don't know, Jess. I'm tired. Maybe I'll sit this one out." Jessica spun around, hands on her hips. "Tired? You're 29, not 90. Come on, Andrea, this is what you wanted. Freedom, fun, no rules. Matt's been asking about you all week. Don't flake now." Andrea forced a nod, though her chest tightened. Matt, the real estate guy with the Rolex and the wandering hands. She'd seen him twice since that night at Henry's, each encounter leaving her more hollow than the last. He texted her flirty one-liners, met her for drinks at the rooftop at Vendu, but never asked about her life beyond the surface. She wasn't sure she wanted him to. An hour later, they were on Folly Beach, the Atlantic crashing against the shore in the dark. The bonfire roared, casting flickering shadows over a crowd of 20-somethings sprawled on blankets or dancing to a portable speaker, blasting Jimmy Buffett. Matt greeted Andrea with a beer and a grin, pulling her toward the fire. "There's my Asheville girl," he said, his voice thick with bourbon. "Missed you." She smiled weakly, the beer cold against her palm. "Yeah, been busy." The night unfolded in a haze, Matt's arm around her, the heat of the fire, the laughter of strangers. Jessica flitted between groups, her energy relentless, while Andrea let herself drift. By midnight, Matt led her down the beach, away from the crowd, the sand cool under her bare feet. He kissed her under the pier, his hands rough and insistent, and she kissed him back, searching for something, validation, escape, anything to drown out Rob's voice in her head. When she stumbled back to Jessica's car at 2 a.m., her lips bruised and her hair tangled with salt, she felt no freer than she had in Asheville, just emptier. In Asheville, Rob pedaled harder along the Blue Ridge Parkway, the burn in his legs a welcome distraction from the ache in his chest. The PI Lisa had hired sent a first report yesterday. Photos of Andrea leaving a bar on King Street with a guy in a polo shirt, her arm linked through his. Rob had stared at the grainy images until his eyes blurred, then shoved them into a drawer. He didn't need more proof. She was gone. Work kept him sane. His firm had landed a big forensic audit for a chain of music stores based in Nashville, Tennessee, and they'd tapped him to lead it. It meant a week away from Asheville, a chance to escape the ghost of Andrea in every corner of their Montford Avenue home. He packed a suitcase, suits, laptop, his bike strapped to the car rack, and hit I-40 West, the mountains shrinking behind him. Nashville greeted him with its neon glow, the skyline of Lower Broadway alive with honky-tonk bars and buskers strumming guitars. He checked into a hotel near the Ryman Auditorium, a sleek high-rise with a view of the Cumberland River, and threw himself into the audit. Numbers were his refuge, clean, logical, unyielding. No room for betrayal there. On the third day, he took his bike out to Percy Priest Lake, a sprawling reservoir east of the city. The trails were rugged, lined with cedar trees and dotted with kayakers paddling in the distance. He stopped at an overlook, catching his breath, when a woman's voice broke the silence. "Nice ride, you a local?" He turned to see her, tall, with long dark hair pulled into a ponytail, green eyes bright against the afternoon sun. She wore a nurse's scrubs, a water bottle clipped to her backpack. "No," Rob said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just here for work. You?" "Born and raised," she replied, stepping closer. "Diane Harper. I work at Vanderbilt. Pediatric wing. This is my spot to unwind." "Rob Carter," he said, offering a hand. Her grip was firm, warm. "I'm an accountant, up from Asheville." They fell into easy conversation. About the trails, Nashville's music scene, the best coffee on 12th Avenue South. Diane had a quiet confidence, a steadiness that felt like a balm after weeks of chaos. When she mentioned a cycling group that met near Centennial Park, Rob surprised himself by asking, "Mind if I tag along sometime?" She smiled, a small scar on her chin, catching the light. "Not at all. We ride Tuesdays and Thursdays. Bring that bike, you'll fit right in." Charleston's days bled into nights for Andrea. She taught her third-grade class at a charter school on Meeting Street by day, her voice steady as she guided kids through math worksheets, but her mind was elsewhere. By night, she followed Jessica to bars like The Ordinary or Blind Tiger, meeting Matt or whoever else Jessica dragged along. She'd stop counting the men, Matt, a guy named Jake from Sullivan's Island, a bartender with tattoos snaking up his arms. Each encounter was a fleeting high, followed by a crash that left her staring at the ceiling of Jessica's apartment, wondering what she was chasing. One night, after a blurry evening at the Darling Oyster Bar, she woke to a text from her mother. "Rob called. Said you're in Charleston with Jessica. What's going on, Andrea? Call me." Panic clawed at her. She hadn't told her family. She couldn't face their judgment. She ignored the message, but the seed of doubt grew. Jessica noticed her mood the next morning, perched on the kitchen counter with a Bloody Mary. "What's with the long face? You're supposed to be having fun." "My mom knows I'm here," Andrea said, her voice small. Rob told her. Jessica snorted. "So, let him tattle. You're not doing anything wrong. You're just living. He's the one stuck in the past." But Andrea wasn't so sure anymore. She thought of Rob, the way he grilled steaks on their porch, the quiet pride in his voice when he talked about their future. Had she thrown that away for this? For Matt's shallow charm and Jessica's reckless gospel? That night, at a house party on James Island, she hit her breaking point. Matt was there, drunk and loud, pulling her onto a couch while Jessica danced with some guy in the backyard. His hands roamed too far, and when she pushed him away, he laughed. "Lighten up, Asheville. This is what you wanted, right?" She stood trembling and walked out to the street, the humid air thick with cicadas. She called a cab back to Jessica's, packed her bag, and left a note. "Need space. Going to a hotel. Talk later." At the Francis Marion Hotel downtown, she locked herself in a room overlooking Calhoun Street and cried. For Rob, for herself, for the mess she'd made. In Nashville, Rob rode with Diane's cycling group the next Tuesday, the pack weaving through Centennial Park under a sky streaked with dusk. She kept pace beside him, her laughter cutting through the wind as they raced past the Parthenon replica. After, they grabbed burgers at the pharmacy on McFerrin Avenue, splitting a basket of fries and talking until the place emptied out. "She left me," Rob admitted over his second beer, the words spilling out. "Wants an open marriage. Moved to Charleston with a friend. I don't even know who she is anymore." Diane listened, her green eyes steady. "That's rough. But you're here, not there. That says something." He nodded, the knot in his chest loosening just a fraction. "Yeah, maybe it does." When he drove back to Asheville that weekend, the PI's final report waited in his inbox. Photos of Andrea on Folly Beach, kissing a guy by the pier. He didn't flinch this time. He called Lisa. "File it." Charleston's humidity hung heavy over the Francis Marion Hotel as Andrea sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper. It had been 3 days since she'd fled Jessica's apartment on East Bay Street. 3 days of silence broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional buzz of her phone. Jessica had texted relentlessly. "Where are you? Don't be dramatic. Come back." But Andrea hadn't replied. She couldn't face the chaos she'd let herself fall into, not yet. The room overlooked Calhoun Street, where tourists strolled past the College of Charleston, their laughter drifting up through the open window. Andrea's duffel bag sat unpacked by the door, a reminder of how temporary this felt, like she was floating, untethered from the life she'd known in Asheville. She'd called in sick to her teaching job at the charter school, claiming a stomach bug, but the truth was she couldn't face her students, not with the weight of what she'd done pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from her mother. She let it ring, then relented on the fifth chime. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice hoarse. "Andrea Marie Carter, what in God's name is going on?" Her mother's voice was sharp, edged with worry. "Rob called me last week, said you left him, moved to Charleston with that Jessica girl. Tell me he's wrong." Andrea closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. "He's not wrong. I'm here. I needed a break." "A break?" Her mother's tone rose. "From your husband? Your marriage? Rob said you're seeing other men, Andrea. Is that true?" She wanted to lie, to say it was a misunderstanding, but the words stuck in her throat. "It's complicated, Mom. I thought it'd help me. Help us. But it's not what I expected." "Complicated?" Her mother scoffed. "You're throwing away a good man for some foolish fling. I raised you better than this. What happens when you wake up and realize what you've lost?" "I don't know," Andrea whispered, tears burning her eyes. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Her mother softened, just a fraction. "Come home, honey. To Asheville, to Rob. Fix this before it's too late." But Andrea couldn't. Not yet. She hung up, the silence swallowing her again. That night, she ordered room service, a shrimp and grits plate she barely touched, and stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment with Rob. The way he'd looked at her in their dining room, hurt and resolute. The way she'd walked out anyway. The next morning, a knock jolted her awake. She opened the door to find Jessica, arms crossed, her blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. "You can't just ghost me," Jessica said, pushing past her into the room. "What's your deal?" Andrea shut the door, leaning against it. I needed space, Jess. Everything, it's too much." Jessica rolled her eyes, flopping onto the bed. "Too much? You were fine at Folly Beach, making out with Matt under the pier. Don't act like a nun now." "That's the problem," Andrea snapped, her voice breaking. "I'm not fine. I feel like shit, Jess. I left Rob for this. For bars and random guys who don't give a damn about me. What am I doing?" Jessica sat up, her expression hardening. "You're living, Andrea. You said Rob wasn't enough, that you needed more. I'm giving you more. If you're too scared to handle it, that's on you." Andrea shook her head, tears spilling over. "This isn't more. It's nothing. I thought it'd make me feel free, but I just feel lost." Jessica stood, grabbing her purse. "Fine, wallow here if you want, but don't expect me to hold your hand while you cry over a guy who's probably already moved on." She stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Alone again, Andrea sank to the floor, sobbing. She'd burned every bridge, Rob, her mother, now Jessica, and all she had left was a hotel room and a hollow ache. That afternoon, she checked out, rented a car, and drove aimlessly along the coast, past Sullivan's Island and Isle of Palms, the ocean a endless gray mirror of her regret. In Nashville, Rob pedaled alongside Diane through Radnor Lake State Park, the trail winding past still waters and hardwood forests ablaze with autumn color. It was Thursday, their second ride with the cycling group, and the crisp Tennessee air felt like a lifeline. Diane rode ahead, her dark hair streaming behind her, then slowed to match his pace. "You're quiet today," she said, glancing over. "Everything okay?" Rob shrugged, his breath fogging in the chill. "Just thinking. Got some news from my lawyer yesterday. She's filing the divorce papers." Diane nodded, her green eyes steady. "Big step. How do you feel about it?" "Relieved, mostly," he said, surprised at how true it felt. "Hurt too, but it's time. Andrea's made her choice." They stopped at an overlook, the lake stretching out below, framed by cedar trees. Diane unclipped her water bottle, taking a sip. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want, but I'm here." He smiled, a small, genuine thing. "Thanks, it's complicated. She wanted an open marriage, moved to Charleston to explore. I couldn't live with that. Diane's brow furrowed. Open marriage? That's a hell of a curveball. Most people don't ask for that unless they're already halfway out the door. Yeah, Rob said, staring at the water. I think she was. The PI I hired sent photos, her with some guy on a beach, Folly Beach, near Charleston. That was the last straw. Diane touched his arm, a brief, warm gesture. I'm sorry, Rob. You deserve better than that. He met her gaze, the scar on her chin catching the light. Maybe, starting to think I might find it. She laughed, soft and easy, and they rode on, the tension in his chest easing with every mile. After the ride, they grabbed coffee at Frothy Monkey on Fifth Avenue, sitting outside under a string of Edison bulbs. Diane told him about her work at Vanderbilt, long shifts in the pediatric wing, kids who broke her heart and mended it daily. He told her about Asheville, the mountains, the life he'd built with Andrea that was now crumbling. You ever think about starting over somewhere new? She asked, stirring her latte. Sometimes, he admitted. Nashville's growing on me. But I've got a job in Asheville, a house. Roots, you know? Roots can be replanted, she said, her tone light but pointed. Just saying. He drove back to Asheville that weekend, Diane's words lingering. The PI's photos sat on his kitchen counter, a stark reminder of Andrea's betrayal. He called Lisa. Serve her the papers. I'm done waiting. A week later, Andrea stood in a CVS on King Street, staring at a positive pregnancy test. Her hands shook as she clutched the stick, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. She'd missed her period, chalked it up to stress. But this was real. Matt? Jake? The bartender? She couldn't pin it down, couldn't face the shame of not knowing. She drove to Jessica's apartment, her rental car rattling over the cobblestones. Jessica opened the door, her expression sour. Back already? Thought you were done with me. I'm pregnant, Andrea blurted, her voice trembling. I don't know what to do. Jessica's eyes widened, then narrowed. Shit, who's the father? I don't know, Andrea said, tears spilling over. Matt, maybe, or someone else. I've been so stupid, Jess. Jessica pulled her inside, shutting the door. Okay, calm down. We'll figure it out. You're not keeping it, right? Andrea sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I don't know. I can't think straight. That night, a courier arrived with an envelope. Divorce papers from Rob, stamped with an Asheville postmark. She stared at the pages, her world collapsing. She'd lost him, lost everything. And now this, a child she hadn't planned, a future she couldn't see. In Nashville, Rob invited Diane to dinner at the Southern on the 3rd Avenue, a bustling steakhouse with live music drifting from the bar. They shared a bottle of red wine, laughing over stories of her worst patients in his most tedious audits. When the check came, he reached for her hand across the table. I'm heading back to Asheville tomorrow, he said, but I'd like to see you again. Maybe next weekend? She smiled, squeezing his hand. I'd like that. Ever been to Savannah? It's a quick trip from here. Great food, better views. Savannah, he mused, remembering his honeymoon with Andrea. Yeah, let's do it. As he drove east on I-40, the Blue Ridge Mountains rising ahead, he felt a shift, a shedding of the past, a step towards something new. Savannah with Diane wasn't a replacement for Andrea. It was a reclaiming of himself. The Charleston sky was a bruise of gray clouds as Andrea sat in a clinic on Rutledge Avenue, the antiseptic smell sharp in her nose. The divorce papers from Rob lay crumpled in her purse beside the positive pregnancy test, both a damning pair of truths she couldn't escape. The doctor, a kind-eyed woman in her 50s, confirmed what the CVS stick had told her. 6 weeks along. Andrea nodded numbly as the woman handed her a pamphlet about prenatal care, her voice a distant hum. 6 weeks. It could be Matt's or Jake's or the bartender's. She lost track of the nights, the faces, the fleeting highs that had led her here. Back at the Francis Marion Hotel, where she'd returned after leaving Jessica's, she stood at the window overlooking Marion Square. The park was quiet, a few joggers braving the drizzle, the statue of John C. Calhoun staring down like a judge. She pressed a hand to her stomach, imagining the life there. Unplanned, unwanted, a consequence of her recklessness. She'd called Jessica that morning, hoping for support, but the conversation had soured fast. You're keeping it? Jessica had asked, incredulous, her voice crackling through the phone. Andrea, you're a mess. You can't raise a kid like this, divorced, broke, living in a hotel. I don't know what I'm doing, Andrea had snapped. I just need you to listen, not judge. Jessica sighed. Fine, but don't expect me to play auntie. This is your mess. Clean it up. The call ended, and Andrea felt the last thread of her old life snap. She'd burned every bridge. Rob, her mother, Jessica, and now she was alone with a child she hadn't asked for. The divorce papers sat on the desk, a temporary restraining order tucked at the back barring her from the Montford Avenue house in Asheville until the settlement. Rob wanted a 50-50 split, half the house, half their savings, a clean break. She could buy him out for $150,000 or they'd sell and split the proceeds. Either way, he was done. She drove to Mount Pleasant that afternoon, needing air, needing something to anchor her. The Ravenel Bridge stretched ahead, its cables slicing through the mist, and she parked near Shem Creek, watching shrimp boats bob in the water. Her phone buzzed, a text from her principal at the charter school. Parents are asking questions. Rumors about your personal life. We need to talk. Her stomach sank. Word had spread. Her nights on King Street. Her fling with Matt, a married man whose wife taught at a rival school. She was a third-grade teacher, a role model, and now a scandal. That night, she called Rob. It went to voicemail, his steady voice a knife in her chest. "This is Rob Carter. Leave a message." She hung up, then tried again, her words tumbling out this time. "Rob, it's me. I got the papers. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I messed up, and I don't know how to fix it. I'm pregnant, and I don't even know who the father is. Please, just call me back." He didn't. The silence was her answer. 300 miles south, Rob stood on the balcony of a rental house on Jones Street in Savannah, Georgia, the Spanish moss dripping from live oaks like a curtain. It was his second weekend with Diane, a getaway she'd suggested after their dinner in Nashville. The city felt different now. No ghosts of his honeymoon with Andrea lingered in the cobblestone squares or the murmur of the Savannah River. With Diane, it was new, untainted. They'd arrived Friday night, dropping their bags at the house, a charming two-story with a wraparound porch, before walking to the Gray, a restaurant in a restored bus depot. Over oysters and cocktails, Diane had teased him about his audit stories, her laughter bright against the dim lights. Now, Saturday morning, she stood beside him, a mug of coffee steaming in her hands, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, nudging him with her elbow. He smiled, leaning against the railing. "Just thinking how good this feels, being here with you. It's been a while since I felt steady." Diane's green eyes softened. "I'm glad. You've been through hell, Rob. You deserve steady." He'd told her more over dinner, about Andrea's betrayal, the PI's photos, the divorce filing. Diane hadn't flinched, just listened, her hand resting on his across the table. She'd shared her own scars, a fiancé who'd left her 3 years ago for a coworker, a betrayal that had sent her into nursing school to rebuild. "We're survivors," she'd said, and he'd believed her. They spent the day exploring. River Street's candy shops, Forsyth Park's fountain, a ghost tour that had them laughing more than shivering. At Leopold's ice cream, she smeared a dab of vanilla on his nose, and he retaliated with a swipe of chocolate, their playfulness easing the last knots in his chest. By dusk, they sat on a bench in Monterey Square, the air thick with jasmine, and he kissed her, slow, deliberate, a promise he hadn't made to anyone since Andrea. "I'm moving," he said later, back at the house as they cooked shrimp scampi in the tiny kitchen. "Selling the place in Asheville, starting over." Diane paused, a skillet sizzling behind her. "Where to?" "Here, maybe," he said, meeting her gaze. "Savannah's got charm, and it's closer to Nashville, closer to you." She grinned, setting the spatula down. "I could live with that." In Charleston, Andrea's world unraveled faster. The school put her on leave, unofficial, pending a review, but the writing was on the wall. Parents had complained, whispering about her immoral behavior, and the principal couldn't risk the backlash. She moved into a cheap apartment on Ashley Avenue, a one-bedroom with peeling paint and a leaky faucet, her savings dwindling as she paid for rent and prenatal vitamins. Matt stopped texting after she told him about the pregnancy. "Not my problem," he'd replied, and blocked her number. Jake ghosted her too, and the bartender didn't even remember her name. She saw a doctor on Trad Street who diagnosed a minor STD alongside the pregnancy, treatable but a humiliating reminder of her carelessness. She'd stopped drinking, started taking her pills, but the damage was done. Her mother called again, begging her to come home to Columbia, South Carolina, an hour inland. "You can stay with us," she'd said. "Raise the baby here. Rob's gone, honey. He's not coming back." Andrea refused, too ashamed to face her family, too stubborn to admit defeat. The divorce finalized quietly a month later. No court battle, just signatures and a mediator splitting their assets. She took her half of the Montford House proceeds, $150,000, and put it in a savings account, a lifeline she didn't know how to use. Rob's lawyer sent a final note. "He wishes you well." It broke her more than the papers did. She saw Jessica one last time at a coffee shop on Queen Street. Jessica looked tired, her usual spark dimmed. "You're really keeping it?" she asked, stirring her latte. "Yeah," Andrea said, her hand resting on her barely there bump. "It's all I've got left." Jessica nodded, no judgment this time. "Good luck, Andrea. You'll need it." In Savannah, Rob and Diane moved fast. He sold the Asheville house in a week, the sage green bungalow snapped up by a young couple from Raleigh. With the proceeds, he bought a fixer-upper on Habersham Street, a Victorian with good bones and a porch swing Diane adored. His firm let him work remotely with occasional trips to Nashville, and he joined a cycling group that rode out to Tybee Island. Diane split her time between Savannah and Nashville, her shifts at Vanderbilt winding down as she applied for a job at Memorial Health. They painted the house together, soft blue walls, white trim, laughing over paint splatters, and late-night pizza from Vinnie Van Gogh's. One evening on the porch swing, he pulled out the sapphire pendant he'd never given Andrea, its box worn from months in his drawer. "Thought you might like this," he said, fastening it around Diane's neck. "A new start." She touched the stone, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful, Rob." They married that summer in Forsyth Park, a small ceremony under the oaks, her green eyes locking with his as they said their vows. By Christmas, she was pregnant, planned, wanted, a joy that filled their Savannah home with light. Andrea, in Charleston, gave birth alone in a hospital on Jonathan Lucas Street, a boy with hazel eyes she named Liam. She taught part-time at a daycare, her reputation scarred but her resolve hardening. She'd lost Rob, lost herself, but Liam was her redemption, a fragile thread to a future she'd fight for. The Charleston sun hung low over the Ashley River, casting a golden sheen across the water as Andrea pushed Liam's stroller along the Battery Promenade. At 8 months, Liam was a bundle of energy, hazel eyes wide with curiosity, his chubby hands clutching a toy crab she'd bought at the city market. His auburn hair, so like hers, caught the light, and she smiled despite the ache that never fully left her chest. Her apartment on Ashley Avenue had become a home, however modest. Secondhand furniture from a thrift shop on Spring Street, a crib wedged into the corner of her bedroom, walls plastered with Liam's finger paint masterpieces. She'd found stability, piecing together a life from the wreckage of her past. The daycare job had turned permanent, a small gig teaching toddlers their ABCs and wiping sticky hands, but it paid the rent. Her teaching career at the charter school was a distant memory, buried under the scandal that still whispered through Charleston's tight-knit circles. Liam giggled as a pelican swooped low over the water, and Andrea stopped to adjust his sun hat. She thought of Rob often, too often, wondering where he was, what he'd made of the life she'd abandoned. The divorce had finalized over a year ago, the Montford Avenue house sold, her half of the proceeds sitting untouched in a savings account she'd earmarked for Liam's future. She'd heard through her mother, who still lived in Columbia, that Rob had left Asheville. No details, just a vague "he's moved on." It stung, but she couldn't blame him. Jessica was a ghost now, too. They drifted apart after Liam's birth, their last meeting a strained coffee at Kudu on Vanderhorst Street. Jessica had looked at Liam with something like pity, muttering, "You're tougher than I thought," before leaving for a date on Folly Beach. Andrea didn't miss her, not the chaos, not the reckless nights. She'd learned the hard way that freedom wasn't found in bars or strangers' arms. It was in the quiet moments like this one, with Liam's laughter filling the silence. Her STD had cleared with treatment, a bitter footnote to her spiral, but the pregnancy had left stretch marks and a new weight around her middle she couldn't shake. She didn't mind. Liam was worth it. She'd stopped looking for the father, accepting that he'd never be more than a shadow in her son's life. Matt had moved to Atlanta with his wife, Jake had vanished, and the bartender was a blur. Liam was hers alone, and that was enough. A letter arrived that morning, forwarded from her old address, a wedding announcement from her cousin in Greenville. She'd skimmed it, then froze at a line buried in the family gossip. Rob Carter married a nurse from Nashville last summer. They're expecting a baby in Savannah. The paper slipped from her hands, landing on the kitchen counter beside Liam's sippy cup. She'd cried then, not out of jealousy but loss, a final confirmation that Rob had rebuilt what she'd broken. Now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she lifted Liam from the stroller and held him close, his warmth grounding her. "We're okay, buddy," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Just you and me." She'd made mistakes, catastrophic ones, but Liam was her redemption, a chance to be better than she'd been. Savannah, Georgia. 2 years later, the Savannah morning was soft and warm, the air thick with the scent of magnolias as Rob rocked a sleeping Ella on the porch swing of their Habersham Street home. At 3 months, Ella was a tiny miracle. Dark hair like Diane's, green eyes that mirrored her mother's, a gummy smile that melted him every time. The Victorian house glowed in the dawn light, its blue walls and white trim a testament to the life he'd built with Diane over the past 2 years. Inside, Diane hummed in the kitchen, flipping pancakes on a griddle they'd bought at a flea market on Abercorn Street. She'd left her job at Vanderbilt 6 months ago, taking a position at Memorial Health's pediatric unit, and they'd settled into Savannah full-time. The move from Asheville had been swift. The Montford bungalow sold in a blink, the proceeds funding this fixer-upper they'd poured their hearts into. Every nail hammered, every wall painted, felt like a stitch closing the wounds Andrea had left. Rob adjusted Ella in his arms, her soft breasts tickling his neck. He thought of Andrea less these days, her shadow fading with each milestone. Selling the house, marrying Diane, Ella's birth. The divorce had been clean, a 50-50 split that left no room for lingering ties. He'd heard through a mutual friend that she'd had a son, was raising him alone in Charleston. He didn't hate her, not anymore. She'd chosen her path, and he'd chosen his. Diane stepped into the porch, a plate of pancakes in one hand, a mug of coffee in the other. "Breakfast, Daddy," she said, setting the plate on the wicker table. She wore a loose sundress, her sapphire pendant, his gift from that first Savannah weekend, glinting at her throat. She leaned down to kiss Ella's head. Then Rob's lips, her touch a quiet anchor. "Thanks, babe," he said, shifting Ella to his shoulder. "Smells amazing." They ate in companionable silence, the swing creaking under their weight, the street waking up around them. Dog walkers, cyclists, the distant clang of a trolley on a Broughton Street. After, Diane took Ella inside for a diaper change, and Rob grabbed his bike from the garage, a new Trek he'd bought after joining the Tybee Island cycling group. He rode out to Skidaway Island State Park, the marshes stretching wide under a cloudless sky. The rhythm of the pedals clearing his mind. Back home, he found Diane in the nursery, rocking Ella to sleep. "Good ride?" she asked, her voice low. "Perfect," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Thinking we should take her to Forsyth Park tomorrow. Picnic, maybe." Diane smiled, the scar on her chin crinkling. "Love that. She's ready for her first Savannah adventure." That night, they sat on the couch, Ella napping in a bassinet nearby, a movie playing softly on the TV. Diane rested her head on his shoulder, her fingers tracing lazy circles on his arm. "Happy?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rob kissed her temple, breathing in the lavender of her shampoo. "More than I thought I could be." He'd lost Andrea to her chaos, but he'd found Diane, and with her, a family, a home, a life that fit. Savannah wasn't just a place. It was a promise kept, a redemption he hadn't known he'd needed. The threads converge. In Charleston, Andrea pushed Liam on a swing at Waterfront Park, the pineapple fountain splashing behind them. He squealed, his tiny legs kicking, and she laughed, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. She'd started therapy last month, a quiet woman on Broad Street who helped her untangle the guilt and shame. She was saving for a house, something small near West Ashley, a fresh start for her and Liam. The road ahead was long, but she walked it with purpose. In Savannah, Rob and Diane strolled through Forsyth Park, Ella gurgling in her stroller as they spread a blanket under the oaks. The fountain sprayed mist into the air, and Rob snapped a photo, Diane's arm around him, Ella's tiny hand clutching his finger. He sent it to his parents in Raleigh, a quiet announcement of the life he'd reclaimed. Two coasts, two lives, diverged by choices, bound by echoes. Andrea and Rob would never cross paths again, Their stories sealed in the salt of Charleston and the moss of Savannah. She'd fallen and risen, a mother forged in fire. He'd broken and rebuilt, a husband and father made whole. The past was a shadow, faint and fleeting, overtaken by the light of what they'd each become.